The gunshot that echoed through the church was meant for him, but Zachary Kincaid was already gone when the bullet splintered the wooden doorframe where his head had been seconds before. He had learned long ago that staying in one place too long in 1876 was a good way to end up with a belly full of lead, especially when you had a reputation for being faster with a pistol than most men were with their thoughts. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty streets of Nevada, Missouri, as he pushed through the church doors, chest heaving, sweat trickling down his temple, despite the October chill that had settled over the town. He expected the building to be empty, a place to catch his breath and figure out how to lose the 3 men who had followed him from the saloon after he had cleaned them out at poker. What he did not expect was the woman sleeping in the third pew from the front, her dark hair spilling over the worn wood like silk over stone. Zachary froze, his hand still on his gun, his breathing the only sound besides the distant shouts of the men searching for him outside. She looked like she had been there for hours, maybe longer, her thin dress doing little to protect her from the cold that seeped through the church walls. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the filtered light, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion beyond anything a single night could cause. He should have left her there, should have found another way out, but something about the way she lay curled against herself, vulnerable and alone, made him pause. In his 30 years of life, Zachary had seen plenty of people down on their luck, had been one himself more times than he cared to count. But there was something different about her, something that pulled at a part of him he thought had died years ago. He moved closer, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor, years of practice making his movements silent as a shadow. Up close, he could see the dirt on her hands, the tears in her dress, the way her lips were cracked from dehydration. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fine clothes or careful grooming. It was the kind of beauty that came from somewhere deeper, the kind that would still be there when everything else had been stripped away. Zachary found himself reaching out before he could stop himself, his calloused fingers gentle as they touched her shoulder. "Madam," he said softly, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. "Madam, you need to wake up." She stirred but did not open her eyes, a small sound escaping her throat that might have been protest or plea. Zachary glanced toward the door, knowing those men would check the church eventually, knowing he was putting them both at risk by staying. But he could not leave her here. Not like this, not when she looked like she had been abandoned by the world and everyone in it. "Please," he tried again, his hand still on her shoulder, feeling the fragile bone beneath the thin fabric. "You cannot stay here. It is not safe." This time her eyes opened, and Zachary found himself looking into depths of amber that seemed to hold entire stories he could not begin to read. She blinked up at him, confusion clouding her features, and then fear flickered across her face as she realized a stranger was touching her. She pulled back, pressing herself against the pew, her hands coming up defensively. "Easy," Zachary said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I am not going to hurt you, but there are men outside who might, and I think it would be best if we were both somewhere else right about now." "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, and Zachary could hear the thirst in it. "Name is Zachary Kincaid. I am what you might call a professional gambler, though some would use less charitable terms." He offered her a slight smile, hoping to ease the fear he saw in her eyes. "What is yours?" She hesitated, and he could see her weighing whether to trust him, whether she had any choice in the matter. "Fiona," she said finally. "Fiona Sullivan." "Well, Miss Sullivan, I do not mean to be forward, but you look like you have not eaten or drunk anything in quite some time, and this church is about to get very unfriendly very quickly. I have a place outside of town, nothing fancy, but it is warm and safe and has food and water aplenty." He paused, then added the words that surprised him even as he said them. "Come home with me, please." Fiona stared at him for a long moment, and Zachary could see the war playing out behind her eyes. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe anything he said, but she also looked like she had run out of options some time ago. Finally, she nodded, a small movement that somehow felt like the most significant gesture Zachary had seen in years. "I do not have anywhere else to go," she admitted, and the vulnerability in those words made something in Zachary's chest tighten. "Then we best get moving," he said, offering her his hand. She took it, her fingers cold and trembling in his, and he helped her to her feet. She swayed for a moment, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow, feeling how light she was, how close to falling she seemed. "Can you ride?" "I think so," she said, though her voice held doubt. "Good enough?" Zachary led her toward the back of the church, where a small door opened onto an alley. He checked outside first, making sure the coast was clear, then guided Fiona toward where his horse was tethered behind the general store. The bay gelding nickered softly as they approached, and Zachary quickly untied the reins, keeping one eye on the street. He could hear the men still searching, their voices growing louder as they worked their way toward the church. "Up you go," he said, helping Fiona into the saddle before swinging up behind her. She tensed at the closeness, but he kept his touch respectful, one arm around her waist to keep her steady, the other holding the reins. "Hold on." He urged the horse into a walk, keeping to the shadows, working their way out of town through the back streets and alleyways. It was slow going, every sound making his hand twitch toward his gun. But finally they cleared the last building, and the open prairie stretched before them. Only then did Zachary let the horse break into a canter, putting distance between them and Nevada, between them and whatever trouble was brewing back there. Fiona said nothing during the ride, her body rigid against his, and Zachary did not push for conversation. He could feel her exhaustion in the way she gradually began to lean back against him, her strength finally giving out now that someone else was carrying the burden. His ranch was about 5 miles out of town, a modest spread with a small house, a barn, and enough land to run a few head of cattle. It was not much, but it was his, bought with money he had won at cards and kept through sheer stubbornness and skill with a gun. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Zachary why he had chosen this place despite all its hardships. He helped Fiona down from the horse, and she stood unsteadily while he quickly unsaddled the gelding and turned it into the corral. Then he guided her toward the house, one hand on her elbow to keep her from falling. Inside, the house was simple but clean, a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom, and a small washroom he had added the previous year. Zachary settled Fiona into a chair at the table and immediately went to pump water into a cup. She drank it like a woman dying of thirst, which he supposed she might have been, and he refilled it twice more before she finally slowed down. "When did you last eat?" he asked, already moving to the stove where he kept a pot of stew perpetually simmering. "I do not remember," Fiona admitted, and Zachary heard the shame in her voice. 2 days, maybe 3. He ladled out a generous portion of stew and set it before her with a hunk of bread, then watched as she ate with the kind of hunger that spoke of true desperation. While she ate, he studied her more carefully in the lamplight. The tears in her dress looked deliberate, like someone had grabbed her, and there were bruises on her arms that were just beginning to yellow at the edges. Her hair had probably been carefully styled at some point, but now hung in tangles, and her hands, despite the dirt, looked like they had once been soft and well cared for. "What happened to you?" he asked when she had finished eating and was working on her 3rd cup of water. Fiona looked down at her hands and he saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "I was supposed to get married," she said finally. 3 weeks ago. To a man my father chose, a banker from Kansas City. Rich, respectable, everything my family wanted. But not what you wanted," Zachary guessed. "No." The word was barely audible. "He was cruel. I saw it in how he treated his servants, in the way he spoke to people he thought were beneath him. But my father would not listen. He said I was being silly, that all men were stern with their inferiors, that I would learn to appreciate having a husband who knew how to manage things." She looked up at Zachary, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. "So I ran. The night before the wedding, I took what little money I had, and I ran. I thought I could make it to my aunt in St. Louis, but I did not know how far it really was, and the money ran out so much faster than I expected." "And you ended up in Nevada," Zachary said. Fiona nodded. "I have been sleeping wherever I could, trying to stay out of sight. The church seemed safe, quiet. I must have fallen asleep waiting for it to get dark so I could keep moving." "Where were you planning to go?" Zachary asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I do not know," Fiona admitted. "Just away, anywhere but back." Zachary stood and poured himself a cup of coffee, needing something to do with his hands while he thought. Every reasonable part of his brain was telling him to give her some supplies and point her toward the nearest town where she might find decent work. He was not a hero, had never pretended to be one, and taking in a runaway bride was the kind of complication that could follow a man for years. But when he looked at her sitting at his table, exhaustion and fear and determination all mixed together in her expression, he found that the reasonable parts of his brain were losing the argument. "You can stay here," he heard himself say, "at least for a while, until you figure out what you want to do next. I have an extra room, or you can take the bedroom and I will sleep out here. Either way, you will be safe, and you will have food and a roof over your head." Fiona stared at him like he had just offered her the moon. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." "Maybe that is exactly why," Zachary said. "I do not know you, so I do not have any expectations of who you are supposed to be or what you are supposed to do. You are just a woman who needs help, and I am a man who happens to be in a position to give it." He paused, then added, "Besides, I do not think I could live with myself if I sent you back out there alone." "Thank you," Fiona whispered, and the gratitude in her voice was so profound it made Zachary uncomfortable. He was not used to being seen as someone who did good things, was not sure he deserved that kind of recognition. "Do not thank me yet," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "You have not seen how boring it gets out here. Might be begging to leave within a week." But Fiona smiled, a small thing that transformed her face, and Zachary felt something shift in his chest, something he had not felt in so long he had almost forgotten what to call it. Hope, maybe, or possibility, or something else entirely that he was not ready to name. He showed her to the bedroom, giving her one of his shirts to sleep in since her dress was barely holding together, and left her with a basin of water to wash up. While she cleaned herself up, Zachary made himself comfortable on the floor in the main room, using his saddle as a pillow, like he had done countless times on the trail. It was not the most comfortable arrangement, but he had certainly slept in worse places, and knowing Fiona was safe and warm in the next room made the hard floor seem entirely bearable. Sleep did not come easily, though. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, and thought about the woman in his bedroom. He had acted on impulse, something he rarely did anymore, and now he was committed to a course of action that could complicate his life in ways he could not begin to predict. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her face as she had looked in the church, abandoned and alone, and he knew he would make the same choice again without hesitation. The next morning, Zachary woke to the smell of coffee and found Fiona already up and dressed in her torn dress, standing at the stove with a determined expression. She had clearly figured out where he kept things and had taken it upon herself to make breakfast. The coffee was strong and hot, and she had managed to fry up some bacon and eggs with the skill of someone who knew her way around a kitchen. "You did not have to do this," Zachary said as he sat down at the table, still working the sleep out of his eyes. "You are letting me stay here," Fiona said. "The least I can do is earn my keep." "This is not a business arrangement," Zachary protested, but he was already digging into the food, realizing he had not eaten properly the day before in all the chaos. "Maybe not, but I need to feel useful," Fiona said, sitting down across from him with her own plate. "I have spent my entire life being told what to do and who to be. Making breakfast is the first choice I have made for myself in longer than I care to admit." Zachary considered that as he ate, understanding the need for agency more than he might have expected. "Well, the food is excellent, so I am certainly not going to complain, but you should know you do not owe me anything. You are not a servant here, and I do not expect you to act like one." "Then what am I?" Fiona asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice, like she truly did not know how to categorize their arrangement. "A guest," Zachary said after a moment. "A friend, if you want to be. Someone who is welcome here for as long as she needs to be." Fiona smiled at that, and Zachary found himself smiling back, the expression feeling foreign on his face. He was not a man given to easy smiles or casual friendships, had learned early that letting people in was a good way to get hurt. But something about Fiona made him want to take that risk, made him want to believe that maybe not everyone would disappoint him in the end. The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm. Zachary would wake early and tend to the animals and whatever work needed doing around the ranch, while Fiona would handle the house and the cooking. They did not talk much at first, both of them feeling their way through this new situation, but gradually conversation became easier, more natural. Zachary learned that Fiona had been raised in a wealthy family in Illinois, that her mother had died when she was young, and her father had remarried a woman who cared more about social standing than anything else. Her stepmother had been the one to arrange the marriage to the banker, seeing it as an opportunity to elevate their family's position even further. "She never liked me," Fiona admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set. "I was too willful, too interested in things that did not matter to her, books and ideas and questions about the world. She wanted me to be demure and obedient, a perfect little ornament for her drawing room." "Sounds suffocating," Zachary said, and he meant it. "It was," Fiona agreed, "but I did not realize how much until I left. Out here I can breathe, I can think my own thoughts and make my own choices, even if those choices led me to sleeping in a church and nearly starving to death." "You are a survivor," Zachary said. "That is worth more than all the social graces in the world." Fiona looked at him, and in the fading light, her eyes seemed to glow. "You are not what I expected a cowboy to be." "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone rougher, maybe, less thoughtful. The stories always make cowboys out to be wild and reckless." "Some are," Zachary admitted, "but most of us are just trying to make a living, and maybe find a little peace in the process. The wildness comes from the world we live in, not from who we are inside." "I think you are more thoughtful than you give yourself credit for," Fiona said softly. Zachary did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and they sat in comfortable silence until the stars began to appear overhead. He was acutely aware of her presence beside him, of the way her hair caught the last of the light, of the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to share space with someone, to have another person's rhythms and routines become part of his daily life. It was strange and unsettling, and somehow exactly right all at once. As the weeks passed, Zachary found himself looking forward to coming back to the house at the end of the day, to the way Fiona's face would light up when she heard him coming, to the conversations they would have over dinner. She was smart and curious, asking him questions about his life and his travels that made him think about things he had long taken for granted. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about the parents he had lost to fever when he was 15, about the years he had spent drifting from town to town, trying to find a place where he fit. He told her about the fights he had been in, the men he had known, the close calls that should have killed him, but somehow did not. In turn, Fiona opened up about her own life, about the loneliness of growing up in a house full of people who did not understand her, about the books she had read in secret because her stepmother thought too much learning would make her unmarriageable. She talked about her dreams of seeing the world, of going to places she had only read about in books, of being more than just someone's wife or daughter. Zachary listened and found himself wanting to give her those things, to show her the world beyond the narrow confines of what her family had planned for her. One afternoon in late November, Zachary came back from town with a package wrapped in brown paper. He had been making weekly trips to Nevada to buy supplies and keep an ear out for any news about men looking for a runaway bride, but so far there had been nothing. Either Fiona's family had given up looking, or they were searching in the wrong places. Either way, he was grateful for the reprieve. "What is that?" Fiona asked as he set the package on the table. "Something for you," Zachary said, suddenly feeling awkward about the gesture. "Your dress is practically falling apart, and winter is coming. You need something warmer." Fiona unwrapped the package carefully, and her eyes widened when she saw the dress inside. It was simple, made of sturdy brown cotton with long sleeves and a high neck, but it was new and whole and would keep her warm through the cold months ahead. There was also a coat, thick wool dyed dark blue, and a pair of boots that looked like they would actually fit. "Zachary, I cannot accept this," Fiona protested, though he could see the longing in her eyes as she touched the fabric. "It is too much." "It is practical," Zachary said firmly. "You cannot go through winter in that torn dress. Besides, I won a good hand last week. Consider it an investment in making sure my cook does not freeze to death." Fiona laughed at that, and the sound filled the house with warmth. "You are impossible." "I have been told that before," Zachary agreed. "Now go try them on and make sure they fit. I had to guess at your size, so I might have gotten it wrong." Fiona took the clothes into the bedroom, and when she emerged a few minutes later, Zachary felt his breath catch. The dress fit her perfectly, highlighting the curves that the torn garment had hidden, and the color brought out the amber in her eyes. She looked healthy now, no longer pale and gaunt, and the smile on her face was radiant. "It is perfect," she said. "Thank you." "You are welcome," Zachary managed, trying to ignore the way his heart was beating faster. He had bought the clothes as a practical gesture, had told himself it was nothing more than that, but seeing her in them made him realize he had been lying to himself. He cared about Fiona more than he had cared about anyone in a very long time, and the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Fiona moved closer to him on the bench, close enough that their shoulders were touching. Zachary tensed for a moment, unsure what the gesture meant, but then he relaxed into it, enjoying the simple pleasure of her warmth beside him. "I have been thinking," Fiona said after a while, "about what I want to do next." Zachary felt his stomach drop, even though he had known this conversation was coming eventually. "And I think I want to stay," Fiona said, and when Zachary looked at her in surprise, she was already looking back, her expression serious. "Here, I mean, with you, if you will have me." "Fiona," Zachary started, but she cut him off. "I know it is not proper," she said quickly. "I know people will talk if they find out I am living here with you, but I do not care about proper anymore, and I do not care what people think. I care about this place, and I care about you, and I do not want to leave." "You do not have to leave," Zachary said, his voice rough with emotion. "You can stay as long as you want, forever, if that is what you choose." "Forever is a long time," Fiona said softly. "I know," Zachary replied, "but I find I rather like the sound of it." They sat there in the firelight, not quite touching, but close enough to feel each other's presence, and Zachary felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like coming home. He had spent so many years moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, but now he could not imagine being anywhere but here, with this woman who had stumbled into his life and somehow become the center of it. Winter came in earnest in December, bringing cold winds and occasional snow that blanketed the prairie in white. Zachary taught Fiona how to care for the animals, how to milk the cow and collect eggs from the chickens, how to mend fences and chop wood. She proved to be a quick learner, tackling each new task with determination and a surprising amount of skill. In turn, she taught him things he had never bothered to learn, like how to make proper bread instead of the flat, hard stuff he usually settled for, how to organize the house so everything had its place, how to appreciate the small comforts that made a house into a home. They grew closer as the days grew shorter, their conversations deepening, their silences becoming comfortable. Zachary found himself watching Fiona when she was not looking, memorizing the way she moved, the sound of her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was amused. He was falling in love with her, had probably been falling since the moment he woke her in that church pew, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified him. One evening in mid-December, they were sitting by the fire when Fiona suddenly said, "Tell me about the men who were chasing you that day, the day we met." Zachary sighed, having hoped to avoid this conversation. They were nobody important, just some men who did not like losing at cards and thought they could get their money back by force. "Did you cheat?" Fiona asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, just curiosity. "No," Zachary said firmly. "I do not cheat. I do not need to. I am good at reading people, at knowing when to fold and when to push. That is what makes me successful, not sleight of hand or marked cards." "But people do not always believe that," Fiona guessed. "No, they do not," Zachary agreed. "Some men cannot accept that they were beaten fairly. They would rather believe they were tricked than admit someone else was better." He paused, then added, "I try to avoid those situations when I can, but sometimes you do not know what kind of man someone is until it is too late." "Do you still go into town to play?" Fiona asked. "Once a week or so," Zachary said. "It is how I make most of my money. The ranch provides food and a place to live, but cards pay for everything else." "Is it dangerous?" "It can be," Zachary admitted. "But I am careful. I know when to walk away, and I am fast enough with a gun that most men think twice before pushing things too far." Fiona was quiet for a moment, and Zachary could see her processing this information. Finally, she said, "I worry about you when you go into town." The admission made Zachary's chest tighten. "I have been taking care of myself for a long time," he said gently. "I will be fine." "I know," Fiona said, "but that does not mean I do not worry." Zachary reached over and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers against his. "I will always come back," he promised. "You have my word on that." Fiona squeezed his hand, and when she looked up at him, He saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. She leaned closer, and Zachary met her halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and full of promise. It was not his first kiss, not by a long shot, but it was the first one that felt like it mattered, like it meant something beyond a moment of pleasure. When they pulled apart, Zachary rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling like he had found something he had not even known he was looking for. "I love you," Fiona whispered, and the words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile. "I love you too," Zachary said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I think I have since the moment I saw you in that church." They kissed again, deeper this time, and Zachary felt the last of his walls crumbling, leaving him vulnerable and open and completely at peace with it. They stayed up late into the night, talking and kissing and making plans for a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility. Zachary had never been one for planning ahead, had always lived day to day, but now he found himself thinking about next year and the year after that, about building a life with Fiona that would last. Christmas came, and they celebrated it quietly, just the two of them. Zachary had never put much stock in holidays, but Fiona seemed determined to make it special, decorating the house with evergreen branches and baking treats that filled the air with the smell of sugar and spice. He gave her a leather-bound journal he had found in town, knowing how much she loved to write, and she gave him a scarf she had knitted in secret, the stitches a little uneven, but warm and made with love. "I have never had a Christmas like this," Fiona said, as they sat by the fire that evening, her head resting on his shoulder. "It feels real, not like something I am supposed to do because it is expected." "I am glad," Zachary said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You deserve to have things that feel real." "So do you," Fiona said, tilting her head up to look at him. "You have given me so much, Zachary. A home, safety, love. I want to give you the same." "You already have," Zachary assured her. "Before you, this place was just somewhere I slept and stored my things. Now it is home. You made it home." January arrived with bitter cold and a snowstorm that kept them housebound for 3 days. They passed the time playing cards, Zachary teaching Fiona the games he knew, and being impressed by how quickly she picked up the strategies. She had a good mind for reading people and situations, and he told her that if she ever needed money, she could probably make a living at cards herself. "I think one gambler in the family is enough," Fiona said with a laugh, and the casual way she said family made Zachary's heart soar. When the storm finally broke and Zachary could make it into town, he had a specific mission in mind. He went to the general store and asked to see the jeweler's case, studying the small selection of rings until he found one that felt right. It was simple, a gold band with a small diamond, nothing ostentatious but beautiful in its simplicity. He paid for it with money he had been saving, money he had always told himself was for emergencies, and realized that this was an emergency of sorts. He was desperate to make Fiona his wife, to have the legal and spiritual right to call her his and to stand beside her as her husband. That evening, after dinner, Zachary led Fiona out onto the porch despite the cold. The sky was clear for the first time in days, stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet, and Zachary took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "Fiona," he started, then had to clear his throat and start again. "Fiona, I am not good at fancy words or grand gestures. I am just a man who plays cards and raises cattle and tries to get through each day the best he can. But you have changed everything for me. You have made me want things I never thought I would want, made me believe in things I thought were only for other people." Fiona was watching him with wide eyes, and he could see she was beginning to understand where this was going. He pulled the ring from his pocket and held it out to her, the gold catching the starlight. "I want to marry you," he said simply. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you, building a home and a future together. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want everything with you if you will have me." Tears were streaming down Fiona's face, but she was smiling, and when she said, "Yes, yes, of course, yes," Zachary felt like he could conquer the world. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deep and passionate, pouring all of his love and hope and joy into that single moment. They were married 3 weeks later in the same church where they had first met, with only the minister and his wife as witnesses. Fiona wore the brown dress Zachary had bought her, and he wore his best shirt and pants, the ones he usually saved for important poker games. It was simple and quick, nothing like the elaborate wedding Fiona's family had planned for her, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. That night, Zachary carried Fiona over the threshold of their home, and she laughed at the gesture, calling him traditional, even as she wrapped her arms around his neck. He set her down gently in the bedroom, and they came together with a tenderness that took Zachary's breath away. He had been with women before, brief encounters that meant nothing beyond physical release. But this was different. This was making love, giving himself to someone else completely and having them give themselves in return. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a declaration. And when they finally fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms, Zachary felt more complete than he ever had in his entire life. The rest of the winter passed in a blur of happiness. They worked together to keep the ranch running, making plans for the spring when they could expand their herd and maybe plant a garden. Fiona talked about wanting to learn to ride properly, and Zachary promised to teach her, imagining the two of them riding across the prairie together, free and wild and utterly content. In March, Fiona began to feel ill in the mornings, and it took them both a few days to realize what that meant. When the doctor in town confirmed that she was pregnant, Zachary felt a joy so profound it was almost painful. A child, his child, their child, a living proof of the love they shared. Fiona was equally thrilled, though she admitted to being nervous about becoming a mother. "I never had a good example to follow," she confessed one evening as they sat together, Zachary's hand resting on her still flat stomach. "My mother died when I was so young, and my stepmother was cold and distant. What if I do not know how to do this?" "You will be a wonderful mother," Zachary said with absolute certainty. "You are kind and patient and loving. Everything else you can learn as you go." "We will learn together," Fiona said, covering his hand with hers. "Both of us, figuring it out as we go." "I like the sound of that," Zachary agreed. Spring arrived with green grass and wildflowers, and Fiona's pregnancy began to show. A gentle rounding of her belly that Zachary found endlessly fascinating. He caught himself watching her constantly, marveling at the changes in her body, at the way she glowed with health and happiness. She took to pregnancy well, her morning sickness fading after the first few weeks, and she seemed to have endless energy for working around the house and helping with the ranch. One afternoon in early May, a stranger rode up to the house, and Zachary felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun. But the man raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, showing he meant no harm, and Zachary relaxed slightly, though he remained wary. "Can I help you?" Zachary called out. "I am looking for a woman," the stranger said, and Zachary felt his blood run cold. "Name of Fiona Sullivan. Her family has been searching for her for months now." "Who are you?" Zachary demanded, stepping off the porch to put himself between the stranger and the house, where Fiona had appeared in the doorway. "Name is Thomas Miller. I am a private investigator hired by the Sullivan family to find their daughter." The man's eyes moved past Zachary to Fiona. "Miss Sullivan, your father wants you to come home. He has called off the engagement. He realizes now that he was wrong to force you into a marriage you did not want." "How do I know you are telling the truth?" Fiona asked, her voice steady despite the fear Zachary could see in her eyes. Miller reached into his coat slowly, pulling out a letter. "He sent this? Said you would know his handwriting." Fiona came down from the porch and took the letter, breaking the seal and reading quickly. Zachary watched her face, trying to gauge her reaction, but she kept her expression carefully neutral until she finished. Then she looked up at Miller and said, "Tell my father I appreciate his apology, but I will not be coming home. I have made a new life for myself here, and I am happy. I hope he can respect that." Miller looked surprised. "Miss Sullivan, your father is offering you everything. A place in society, a comfortable life, security. Surely you do not want to throw that away to live out here in the middle of nowhere." "This is not the middle of nowhere," Fiona said firmly. "This is my home, and this is my husband, Zachary Kincaid. We were married in January, and I am carrying his child. My life is here now, and I would not trade it for anything my father could offer." Miller looked between them, clearly trying to decide if she was being coerced or if she truly meant what she was saying. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If that is your choice, I will relay the message. But Miss Sullivan, if you ever change your mind, your father said his door is always open." "Thank you," Fiona said, but I will not be changing my mind." They watched Miller ride away, and then Zachary turned to Fiona, pulling her into his arms. "Are you all right?" "I am perfect," Fiona said, and she sounded like she meant it. For a moment I was afraid, but then I realized that I have nothing to be afraid of anymore. I have you, and I have our child, and I have a life I chose for myself. That is worth more than all the wealth and status in the world. "I love you," Zachary said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I love you too," Fiona replied, "forever and always." Summer came, hot and bright, and Fiona's belly grew round and full. Zachary found himself constantly worrying about her, making sure she did not overwork herself, that she stayed cool during the hottest parts of the day, that she ate enough and rested enough. Fiona tolerated his hovering with amused patience, assuring him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she would be fine. In late August, the pains started, and Zachary rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the county. She arrived at the house and immediately took charge, sending Zachary out to boil water and gather clean linens while she examined Fiona. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning, and Zachary spent every minute of it pacing the main room, jumping at every sound from the bedroom. He had faced down armed men without flinching, had bet everything he owned on a single hand of cards, but nothing had ever terrified him like the sounds of Fiona's pain coming from behind that closed door. Finally, just as the sun was rising, he heard a different sound, a cry, high and strong, the unmistakable wail of a newborn baby. Zachary froze, his heart pounding, and then Mrs. Henderson opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Kincaid, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is doing just fine." Zachary rushed into the room and found Fiona propped up on pillows, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him and smiled, and he had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Zachary approached carefully, afraid he might break something just by being too close, and looked down at the baby in Fiona's arms. He was red-faced and wrinkled, his eyes screwed shut, his tiny fists waving in the air. He was the most perfect thing Zachary had ever seen. "What should we name him?" Fiona asked. Zachary thought for a moment, then said, "What about Matthew, after my father?" "Matthew Kincaid," Fiona said, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the world." The baby squirmed and made a small sound, and Zachary felt his heart expand to a size he had not known was possible. This was his son, his family, his entire world contained in this small room. He had spent so many years alone, had convinced himself that he did not need anyone, but now he could not imagine his life without Fiona and Matthew in it. The weeks that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Matthew was a good baby, only crying when he was hungry or needed changing, but the constant care he required left both Fiona and Zachary perpetually tired. They took turns walking the floor with him during the night, and Zachary discovered a talent for singing lullabies, his deep voice seeming to soothe the baby when nothing else would. As Matthew grew, he began to develop his own personality. He had Fiona's amber eyes and Zachary's dark hair, and a smile that could light up a room. Zachary found himself constantly amazed by the small milestones. The first time Matthew grasped his finger, the first real smile, the way he would track movement with his eyes. One evening in October, a year after Zachary had first found Fiona in that church, they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Matthew slept inside. Fiona leaned against Zachary's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I have been thinking about that day," Fiona said. "The day you woke me in the church and asked me to come home with you." "What about it?" Zachary asked. "I was so lost that day," Fiona said. "I had run away from everything I knew, and I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do. I thought I had made a terrible mistake, that I was going to end up starving to death, or worse. And then you appeared, and you offered me kindness when I had no reason to expect it." "You looked like you needed help," Zachary said simply. "I could not just leave you there." "But you could have," Fiona pointed out. "Most people would have, but you did not. And that changed everything. You saved my life that day, Zachary. In every way that matters, you saved me." "You saved me too," Zachary said. "I just did not know I needed saving until you came along." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Zachary thought about the path his life had taken, about all the choices and chances that had led him to this moment. He had been a drifter, a gambler, a man with no ties and no responsibilities. Now he was a husband and a father, a man with roots that went deep into the Missouri soil, and he could not imagine wanting anything else. The years passed, and life on the ranch continued. Matthew grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved helping his father with the animals and learning to ride. Fiona flourished in her role as wife and mother, but she never lost her curiosity about the world. Zachary bought her books whenever he went to town, and she read them voraciously, then would share what she learned with him and Matthew over dinner. When Matthew was 3, Fiona became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. She had Zachary's dark eyes and Fiona's delicate features, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Matthew was initially unsure about having a sibling, but he quickly became protective of his baby sister, always making sure she had her favorite toys and coming to get his parents if she cried. The ranch grew along with the family. Zachary expanded the herd and built a larger barn, and they hired a young man from town to help with the heavy work. The extra help gave Zachary more time to spend with his family, and he cherished every moment. He taught Matthew to play cards and to shoot, though Fiona made him promise not to let the boy anywhere near a gun until he was old enough to understand the responsibility. He told both children stories about his travels, carefully editing out the more dangerous or inappropriate parts, and watched their eyes grow wide with wonder. Fiona became involved in the church, helping to organize social events and teaching Sunday school. She made friends among the other women in town, though she was careful not to share too much about her past. As far as anyone knew, she was simply Zachary Kincaid's wife, a woman who had come from back east and fallen in love with a cowboy. It was not entirely untrue, and it was close enough to the truth that no one questioned it. One spring afternoon, when Matthew was 7 and Rose was 4, Zachary came back from town with news. "They are building a school," he announced. "It will be ready by fall. Matthew can start attending with the other children." Fiona's face lit up. "That is wonderful. He is so bright, and I have taught him as much as I can from books. A real school will be so good for him." That fall, they sent Matthew to school with a slate and chalk and a lunch packed by Fiona. He came home every day full of stories about what he had learned and the friends he had made. Rose was jealous that she could not go too, but Fiona promised her that she would get her turn in a few years. Life was good, peaceful in a way that Zachary had never experienced before. The violence and uncertainty of his younger years seemed like another lifetime, like they had happened to a different person. He still played cards in town occasionally, but only for modest stakes, and only with men he knew to be reasonable. The desperate edge that had once driven him was gone, replaced by contentment and stability. On a warm evening in June, when Matthew was 10 and Rose was 7, the family sat together on the porch after dinner. A third child, a boy named James, who was 2, played at Fiona's feet with wooden blocks Zachary had carved for him. They watched the sun set over the prairie, painting the grass in shades of gold and amber, and Zachary felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. "What are you thinking about?" Fiona asked, noticing his expression. "Just how lucky I am," Zachary said. "How lucky we are. All of this, everything we have built together, it is more than I ever dreamed was possible." "I feel the same way," Fiona said, reaching over to take his hand. "Every single day, I am grateful for that moment in the church when you woke me and asked me to come home with you. I was so scared, but I trusted you, and that trust gave me everything I ever wanted." "Papa, tell us the story again," Rose piped up, "about how you and Mama met." Zachary laughed. It had become a family tradition, the story of how he had found Fiona in that church pew, how he had woken her gently and brought her home. The children never tired of hearing it, though they knew it by heart. "Well," Zachary began, pulling Rose onto his lap, while Matthew leaned against his shoulder and James abandoned his blocks to climb into Fiona's arms. "It was October of 1876, and I was running from some men who were very unhappy about losing at cards. I ducked into a church thinking it would be empty, but instead I found the most beautiful woman I had ever seen sleeping in the third pew from the front." "That was Mama," Rose said, as she always did. "That was your Mama," Zachary agreed. "And I knew right then that my life was about to change. I woke her gently and I said, 'Come home with me, please.' and for some reason, she said yes. Because she loved you, Matthew said. Well, not yet, Fiona corrected with a smile. I did not love him yet, but I could tell he was a good man, and I needed help, and he offered it freely. The love came later, but it came strong and true, and it has never wavered. Not once, Zachary confirmed, squeezing her hand. Not for a single moment. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, they eventually moved inside, Zachary carrying a sleepy Rose, while Fiona herded Matthew and James. They put the children to bed, tucking them in and kissing them goodnight, and then they retired to their own room, the room where their marriage had been consummated, where their children had been born, where they had shared countless nights of love and comfort. Fiona changed into her nightgown, while Zachary pulled off his boots and shirt, both of them moving through the familiar routine of preparing for bed. When they finally slipped under the covers, Fiona curled into Zachary's side, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had gone back to your family? Zachary asked quietly. If you had accepted your father's apology and returned to Illinois? Sometimes, Fiona admitted, but only to remind myself how grateful I am that I did not. I would have been comfortable, probably, and safe in a conventional sense. But I would have been miserable. I would have spent my whole life wondering what I had given up, what I could have had if I had been brave enough to choose my own path. You were brave enough, Zachary said, braver than anyone I have ever met. We were brave together, Fiona corrected. You took a risk on me, a stranger with nothing to offer but problems and complications. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go, love when I thought I would never find it. We saved each other, Zachary. That is the truth of our story. Zachary pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. I love you, Fiona Kincaid, more today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow. I love you too, Fiona murmured, already half asleep. Forever and always. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Matthew grew into a fine young man, choosing to stay on the ranch and help his father rather than seeking his fortune elsewhere. Rose developed a love of reading like her mother and spent hours with books, dreaming of distant places but always coming back to the home she loved. James was the wild one, always getting into trouble and keeping his parents on their toes. But he had a good heart and a sharp mind. When Zachary was 45 and Fiona was 38, they welcomed their fourth child, another daughter they named Lily. The children were all thrilled to have a baby in the house again, and they helped care for her with a tenderness that made both Zachary and Fiona proud. The ranch was prosperous now, the herd large and healthy, and they had built a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. One evening in late fall, when the air had turned crisp and the leaves were changing colors, Zachary and Fiona took a rare moment alone, riding out to a hill that overlooked their property. From here, they could see the house they had built together, the barn and corrals, the fields where cattle grazed peacefully. Smoke rose from the chimney where Matthew was watching his younger siblings, and everything looked golden in the setting sun. We did well, Zachary said, his arm around Fiona's waist as they stood together. Look at what we built. We did very well, Fiona agreed. Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life, that I get to wake up every morning next to the man I love, surrounded by children who are healthy and happy, in a place I can truly call home. Do you ever regret it? Zachary asked. Leaving everything behind, taking a chance on a stranger? Never, Fiona said firmly. Not once, not for a single second. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Zachary. You gave me freedom and love and a life of my own choosing. How could I ever regret that? Zachary turned her to face him, cupping her face in his hands. She was older now, fine lines appearing at the corners of her eyes and mouth, but to him, she was just as beautiful as she had been that day in the church. More beautiful, actually, because now he knew every part of her, inside and out, and he loved all of it with a depth that still sometimes took his breath away. I found you in that church pew, he said softly. I woke you gently and asked you to come home with me, and you said yes, even though you had no reason to trust me, no reason to believe anything I said. That yes changed my entire life, Fiona. It gave me purpose and meaning and a reason to be better than I was. So, thank you for taking that chance, for saying yes, for choosing me. Tears were streaming down Fiona's face, but she was smiling. I will always choose you, she said, In this life, and whatever comes after, I will always choose you." They kissed as the sun set behind them, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from nothing but love and determination. And when they finally rode back down to the house, back to their children and their life, they did so hand in hand, partners in every sense of the word, grateful for every moment they had been given and eager for all the moments still to come. Matthew eventually married a girl from town, a sweet young woman named Sarah, who fit into the family as if she had always been there. They built a house on the far edge of the property and started their own family, giving Zachary and Fiona their first grandchildren. Rose met a school teacher from Kansas City and moved away, but she wrote long letters and visited as often as she could, bringing her own children to meet their grandparents. James took after his father, developing a talent for cards and business that served him well when he opened a general store in town. And Lily, the youngest, stayed on the ranch, content to help her aging parents and care for the land she loved. As Zachary and Fiona grew older, they began to slow down, letting their children take over more of the work while they enjoyed the fruits of their labor. They spent long afternoons on the porch, watching grandchildren play in the yard, telling stories about the old days, holding hands and simply being together. Their love had not dimmed with age, but had instead deepened, becoming something solid and enduring, a foundation that held up an entire family. On a crisp October morning in 1906, 30 years after the day they met, Zachary woke before dawn, as he always did. But instead of getting up immediately, he lay still, watching Fiona sleep beside him. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with years of laughter and love, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He thought about the impossible journey they had taken together, from that chance meeting in a church to this moment, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in a love that had weathered every storm. Fiona stirred, her eyes opening, and she smiled when she saw him watching her. "Good morning," she murmured. "Good morning," Zachary replied, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "Happy anniversary." "Has it really been 30 years?" Fiona asked, though she knew the answer as well as he did. 30 years since I woke you in that church and asked you to come home with me," Zachary confirmed. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Fiona corrected with a smile. "The best was when I said yes." Zachary laughed, pulling her close, and they lay together in comfortable silence as the sun began to rise outside their window. They had been through so much together, had built a life and a family from nothing but hope and determination. And through it all, the love that had bloomed in those early days had only grown stronger, binding them together in ways that went beyond words or promises. Later that day, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There was food and music and laughter, and Zachary and Fiona sat at the center of it all, holding hands and watching the people they had created together. Matthew stood with his wife and 3 children, telling stories about his father's skill with horses. Rose had come all the way from Kansas City with her family, bringing news and gifts. James entertained everyone with tales from the store, and Lily made sure everyone had enough to eat. As the sun began to set and the party wound down, Zachary stood and raised his glass. "I want to say something," he announced, and the gathered family fell silent, turning to listen. 30 years ago today, I found a woman sleeping in a church pew. She was lost and alone and desperate, and I offered her a home without knowing anything about her, except that she needed help. It was an impulse, a moment of compassion that I did not think about too deeply. But that moment changed everything. Fiona, you have been my partner, my love, my reason for being for 3 decades now. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose beyond just surviving day to day. You made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. So here is to you, to us, to the life we built together, and the love that will outlast us both." Everyone raised their glasses and drank, and then Fiona stood as well. "I have something to say too," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her years. "When Zachary woke me in that church and asked me to come home with him, I was terrified. I had run away from everything I knew, and I had no idea if I was making the right choice. But I looked into his eyes, and I saw kindness there, and goodness, and I decided to trust him. That trust was the foundation of everything that came after. Zachary gave me freedom when I was trapped, love when I thought I would never find it, and a family when I had lost mine. He taught me that home is not a place, but a person, and that person has been by my side for 30 years. I love you, Zachary Kincaid, more than words can ever express. There was not a dry eye in the gathering as Zachary and Fiona embraced, their love for each other radiating out to touch everyone present. The party continued late into the night, filled with joy and gratitude for the life they had all been blessed to share. Years continued to pass, and Zachary and Fiona grew older still. They faced the challenges of aging with the same grace they had brought to everything else, supporting each other through aches and pains, through moments of forgetfulness and frustration. Their children worried about them, but Zachary and Fiona insisted they were fine, that they had each other, and that was all they needed. On a quiet morning in early spring of 1912, Zachary woke to find that Fiona had passed away peacefully in her sleep, still holding his hand. The grief that crashed over him was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. But even through the sorrow, he felt grateful. Grateful for the 36 years they had spent together, for the family they had created, for the love that had filled every day. She had died as she had lived, peacefully and surrounded by love, and he could not have asked for more than that. The family gathered for the funeral, and Zachary stood beside her grave, saying goodbye to the woman who had been his everything. He told stories about how they met, about their life together, about the legacy she had left behind in their children and grandchildren. And when the last prayer had been said and the last mourner had left, he stayed behind, sitting on the ground beside her grave as the sun set. "I will see you again," he promised her softly. "I do not know when or how, but I know that love like ours does not end just because one of us is gone. You will always be with me, Fiona, in every sunset, in every laugh, in every moment of beauty I see. You are written on my soul, and nothing can erase that." Zachary lived for another 3 years after Fiona's death, staying on the ranch and helping where he could, though his body was failing and his spirit longed to join his wife. His children took care of him with the same love and devotion he had shown them, and his grandchildren brought him joy even in his grief. He spent his days remembering, telling stories about Fiona to anyone who would listen, making sure that everyone knew the incredible woman she had been. On a cool October evening in 1915, almost exactly 39 years after the day he had found Fiona in that church pew, Zachary Kincaid passed away peacefully in his sleep. His children found him in the morning, a smile on his face, his hand outstretched as if reaching for someone only he could see. They buried him beside Fiona, reuniting them in death as they had been in life, and on the headstone they placed a simple inscription: Zachary Kincaid, 1846-1915, Fiona Kincaid, 1854-1912, forever together. The ranch continued to thrive under the care of their children and grandchildren, a living testament to the love that had started it all. And every October, the family would gather at the graves, bringing flowers and telling stories about the cowboy who had found a woman in a church pew and had the courage to wake her gently and ask her to come home with him, and about the woman who had been brave enough to say yes. Their love story became family legend, passed down through generations. A reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything, and that true love, once found, never truly ends. The years stretched into decades, and the family grew larger, spreading across the country, but always maintaining ties to the ranch in Missouri. The house that Zachary had built was preserved, carefully maintained by each generation, and it became a place of pilgrimage for descendants who wanted to connect with their roots. The story of Zachary and Fiona was told and retold, embellished slightly with each telling, but always maintaining the essential truth at its core. A man who chose compassion over self-preservation, a woman who chose trust over fear, and a love that had built something lasting from the most unlikely of beginnings. In the church where they had first met, a small plaque was eventually placed, commemorating the encounter that had started it all. And every year on October 15th, the anniversary of that fateful day, someone from the Kincaid family would visit the church and say a prayer of thanks for the chance meeting that had created their entire world. Because that was what it was, they all understood. Not fate or destiny or divine intervention, but simply two people making choices in a moment of need, reaching out to each other across the divide of their circumstances and finding something precious and rare, finding love, finding home, finding everything that mattered in the simple act of saying yes. The legacy they left was not measured in wealth or possessions, though the ranch prospered and the family grew comfortable. It was measured instead in the values they had lived by and passed down: compassion for those in need, courage to make difficult choices, trust in the fundamental goodness of people, and above all, love. Love that was patient and kind, love that endured through hardship and celebrated through joy, love that built families and communities and left the world a little better than it had been found. And so, the story lived on, generation after generation, a testament to the power of a single moment of kindness, a single choice to help a stranger, a single yes that echoed through time. Zachary and Fiona Kincaid had found each other in a church on an October afternoon in 1876, and from that meeting had sprung countless lives, countless loves, countless moments of beauty and grace. They had lived and loved and built something lasting, and in the end, that was all anyone could hope for. To be remembered with love, to leave behind something good, and to know that the choices made in life had mattered, had created ripples that would continue long after the stones had been thrown. Their story was complete, their journey finished, but the love they had shared continued on in every descendant who heard their tale and felt inspired to be braver, kinder, more open to the possibilities that life presented. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of all, not the ranch or the family name or even the memories, but the simple understanding that love was always worth the risk, always worth the leap of faith, always worth saying yes to, no matter how uncertain the outcome might seem. Because in the end, love was what endured, what mattered, what made the journey worthwhile. And they had loved, Zachary and Fiona, with everything they had, holding nothing back. They had loved through good times and bad, through youth and age, through life and into death. Their love had been their greatest accomplishment, their finest legacy, and the truest expression of who they were as individuals and as partners. It had been messy and complicated and sometimes difficult, because real love always was, but it had also been beautiful and transformative and entirely worthwhile. So the story ended where all the best stories do, not with a grand finale or dramatic conclusion, but with a quiet affirmation of what had always been true. That love conquered all, that kindness mattered, that taking chances on people was never a mistake, and that sometimes the simple act of waking someone gently and asking them to come home could change the entire course of two lives, creating something beautiful and lasting, and entirely worth every risk taken along the way. They had found each other, Zachary and Fiona, against all odds and despite all obstacles. They had built a life together that was rich and full and meaningful. And when their time on earth was done, they had left behind a legacy that would endure for generations, a testament to the power of love and the importance of choosing compassion over convenience, trust over fear, and connection over isolation. Their story was complete, their love eternal, and the world was better for having had them in it, even if only for a little while.